Hey guys. I've had the pleasure of visiting Notre Dame many times in my life, most recently with my husband in 2017. I remember marveling at the architecture, how it was somehow delicate yet robust, at the priceless relics. I remember the musky smell as I craned my neck upward, trying to jam each detail, each element of this experience into some secret part of my brain where I could always access it just as it was right in that moment. So I could always remember how it made me feel to be in the presence of hundreds of masters' life's work, a holy place that had endured plagues and wars and countless upheavals, yet always stood there, formidable in its own way. A towering reminder that Christendom is the heart of the Western world, that it's the guiding light for Western man. It's part of who we are and was meant to persevere, not only to protect our civilization and our values, but to protect our souls. Then I walked outside and began making my way to another monument in Paris and was brought back to the reality that we have forsaken our lands, our cultures, our monuments. It was just pushy African peddlers, kebab shops, piles of trash, leering groups of Muslim men and burqa clad women. Something had shifted in Paris. It was nothing like the delightfully smug, decidedly French city I first became acquainted with when I was a teenager. I knew when I visited again in 2015 that the demographic situation was dire. But on my most recent trip in 2017, I really saw that it no longer seemed reversible. The adoption of a more modern culture, the degradation of the city's infrastructure, the perpetual military patrol created this sense of foreboding that hung in the air. The fire of Notre Dame will always be deemed an accident, whether or not it was. I'm of the mindset that it's unlikely it was accidental. Several other French churches have been vandalized in recent months. It's Holy Week. Safeguards to prevent fire, including a thrice daily check of the spire, were in place. And it is an 850-year-old cathedral that for much of its life was lit by candle. It's now being claimed that it was an electrical mishap, whether it was this or a construction worker's lit cigarette or a failing of existing safety precautions or a downgrading of the quality of the renovation team due to diversity hiring or an Islamic response to the Christchurch massacre. At this point, I'm not even sure that it matters. All of these instances are a manifestation of negligence, a lack of care for priceless, holy monuments, a rejection of spirituality, of ancestral wisdom, a stubborn unwillingness to sufficiently safeguard that which has been gifted to us. Of course, this also has symbolic relevance. The death of Western Christianity, forsaking our own people spectacularly to protect the perception that we somehow embody high virtue. If this symbolism were in a movie, I would call it trite. We've lit our own house aflame, yet the greatest symbol of devotion remains untarnished. It's as though we're being told, firmly, perhaps a last warning, that a return to Christianity is our only path to redemption. This has become increasingly apparent to me as I watch this end stage of the West and as I try to resurrect my own relationship with God and with Catholicism. More than anything, our cultural struggle is a spiritual one. It's spiritual warfare. I believe that evil festers and gains strength by identifying and exploiting weakness and fear. In the West, one of our greatest weaknesses is our savior complex. We want the world to think that we are so benevolent that we're constantly engaging in short-sighted nation building.
А теперь слушайте вы, люди из НАТО. Вы бомбите стену, не пропускавшую поток африканской миграции в Европу, стену, тормозившую террористов Аль-Каиды. Этой стеной была Ливия. Вы разрушаете ее. Вы идиоты. За тысячи мигрантов из Африки, за поддержку Аль-Каиды гореть вам в аду. И так оно будет.
This disastrous brand of foreign policy, of course, is also related to our fear and our fragile ego, the deep-seated fear of being viewed globally as intolerant, as bigoted, as racist. Our ancestors would have laughed at the triviality of such a concept, and most modern nations outside of the West, particularly Asian nations, are puzzled by this obsession with political correctness at the direct expense of our well being. Black Pigeon made an excellent video about this. I think he's made a few, but I've linked one in the description below. This fear that we'll be seen as intolerant is the result of decades of social engineering. Part of it is the widespread adoption of atheistic existential nihilism, which was a pervasive philosophy in France especially, but really afflicts all Western nations. This belief that life is purposeless, that humanity doesn't inherently have value, that it doesn't reflect divinity. It lends to individualism, to hedonism. It rejects the value of religion, of collectivism, of national unity. It has atomized us, but the ego remains. As such, we don't identify with Western civilization, but are still individually sensitive to character judgments, like being called intolerant, because we cannot draw strength from our cultural achievements or our sense of unity. This is a grave issue that has grown deep roots in Western culture. Rolling Stone is garbage, but I think this article really sums it up. How should France rebuild Notre Dame? Much of the structure survived the blaze, but as rebuilding efforts move forward, the country will be left with a big question. What does the cathedral mean to 21st century France? For some people in France, Notre Dame has also served as a deep-seated symbol of resentment, a monument to a deeply flawed institution and an idealized Christian European France that arguably never existed in the first place. The building was so overburdened with meaning that its burning feels like an act of liberation. If nothing else, the cathedral has been viewed by some as a stodgy reminder of the old city, the embodiment of the Paris of stone and faith. The question becomes, which Notre Dame are you actually rebuilding? Any rebuilding should be a reflection not of an old France, or the France that never was, a non-secular white European France, but a reflection of the France of today, a France that is currently in the making. The idea that you can recreate the building is naive. It is to repeat past errors, category errors of thought, and one has to imagine that if anything is done to the building, it has to be an expression of what we want, the Catholics of France, the French people, want. What is an expression of who we are now? What does it represent? Who is it for? The French Prime Minister has announced a competition for international architects to rebuild Notre Dame's spire. He said the competition is designed to give the cathedral, quote, a spire adapted to the technologies and challenges of our times. You heard that right. An international competition to replace the spire. No doubt it will be some modern monstrosity designed by a diversity hire, praised by the French and the Western elite as superior in beauty and function. I shouldn't even have to say this, but it's a slap in the face for the French to even consider using a non-French architect. I made a video a few years back called What Will It Take for Europeans to Push Back? In one of these earlier videos, it might have been this one, I can't quite remember, I talk about the inevitability of losing these cultural monuments. When there's a foreign invasion, they always target cultural and religious monuments to show the native population that they are now subjugated to the invader's dominance. This remains true even if the fire was accidental. I believe that, accident or not, this may be a watershed moment. The Yellow Vests have shown us that the French have retained a revolutionary spirit, and I've seen many other encouraging signs that a spiritual connection to their culture, to their monuments, to their God remain. It seems that now is the time that we decide if we do right by our ancestors, if we'll retain our customs and our future, or if we will forsake them for a utopian vision of multiculturalism. And it isn't just going to be maintaining monuments, halting immigration, and expelling migrants. This spiritual connection that has been severed between the Western world and God must be restored. It seems clearer now more than ever that a cultural return to Christianity, a rejection of radical individualism, and an embrace of unity of the collective of Western thought must become the dominant cultural zeitgeist again. No more nihilism, no more atheism, no more hedonism. If we cannot find a way to do this, I'd rather they leave the spire a burned out, hollow image of its former greatness, because that is a more accurate representation of what the West has become. If it cannot see that it has fallen to evil forces and needs to be redeemed, I cannot bear to see a modern edition by a foreign architect grace France's most distinguished emblem of the gifts to the world of Christianity. I am not by any means chastising people for turning away from Christianity. I myself am guilty of this. I've been on some half-assed atheist to agnostic journey for like a decade. Spiritually listless, drifting, purposeless through life with a fair amount of resentment toward God on the days that I even believe. But as this culture war reveals itself to really be a spiritual war, an epic war between good and evil, it has really made me reevaluate. I'm starting to feel in my bones not only the desire, but a burning necessity to find a spiritual path, to return to Christianity, to fight for what's been lost and what has gone up in flames right before our eyes. I don't think I'm alone in this, as I'm seeing it happen a lot in this community. I'm interested in hearing what you have to say because I have a real mix of the religious and the nihilistic in my audience. So I would imagine this video is not going to be well received. If you don't already have one, are you going to try to establish a spiritual existence, or does nihilism truly serve you? Does this event and the events of the past few months feel like definitive turning points for the West, culturally and spiritually? Let me know what you think below. Thanks, folks, and I'll see you soon. Bye.